This is the origin of the term mad as a hatter. In the 1800s, the height of sophistication was literally a cocktail of heavy metals and poison, turning the most elegant ballrooms into silent, beautiful graveyards. When the first steam locomotives began to roar across the countryside in the 1830s, people didn't see them as progress, they saw them as monsters. The iron horse was a terrifying, unpredictable beast made of boiling water and pressurized iron. Early boilers were notorious for catastrophic failure. If a safety valve stuck or a stoker let the water level drop too low, the engine wouldn't just break, it would detonate with the force of a modern bomb, sending shards of jagged metal and scalding steam through anything or anyone nearby. But the most gruesome phenomenon of early rail travel was telescoping. Early train cars were essentially wooden boxes on iron wheels, linked together by simple chains or link and pin couplers. When a train crashed or hit a sudden obstacle, the heavy iron engine would stop, but the momentum of the cars behind it wouldn't. The frame of one car would slide directly inside the body of the car in front of it, telescoping the wood and iron through the passengers. In a matter of seconds, a luxury carriage could become a splintered coffin, crushing the people inside into a pulp of wood and bone. The lighting inside these cars added a final layer of horror. Before electricity, carriages were lit with open-flame kerosene lamps. In a crash, these lamps would shatter, igniting the dry, splintered wood of the wrecked cars. Passengers who survived the initial impact often found themselves pinned under heavy debris as the wreckage turned into an inescapable bonfire. Even the crew lived on the edge of death. The brakeman had one of the deadliest jobs in history. To stop the train, he had to climb out onto the roof of the moving cars, running along the tops in rain, snow, or wind to manually turn the brake wheels on each individual carriage. One slip meant being sucked under the wheels of the very train he was trying to stop. In the early days of the rail, the clatter of the tracks was often the last thing a traveler ever heard. The guillotine was introduced during the French Revolution as a humane alternative to the messy, agonizing work of the executioner's axe or sword. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine argued that his machine would ensure a death that was as quick as a flash of lightning. He famously claimed that the victim would feel nothing more than a slight coolness on the neck. However, as the national razor began claiming thousands of lives during the Reign of Terror, a gruesome question began to haunt the public and the medical community. Does the mind survive the blade? Observation at the scaffold suggested something far more disturbing than a lightning-fast end. Witnesses often reported that severed heads would blink, move their eyes, or contort their faces in expressions of shock or pain. In one famous instance in 1793, after the execution of Charlotte Corday, the assassin of Jean-Paul Marat, the executioner's assistant lifted her head and slapped its cheek. Witnesses swore the face turned red with a look of unmistakable indignation. The debate reached a fever pitch with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Vincent Laborde and later Dr. Gabriel Berieux in 1905. Berieux was allowed to experiment with the head of a condemned man named Languy immediately after the drop. He reported that when he called the man's name, the eyelids slowly lifted and the pupils focused on him with a living look before closing again. He repeated the name, and the eyes opened a second time, staring with undeniable consciousness for several seconds before finally glazing over. Biologically, the horror makes sense. Decapitation causes a massive drop in blood pressure, but the brain does not lose all oxygen instantly. It is estimated that a human head could remain conscious for anywhere from 3 to 13 seconds after the spine is severed. In those final moments, the brain would experience a sensory vacuum. The lungs are gone, the voice is lost, but the eyes might still see the basket, and the ears might still hear the cheering of the crowd. The mercy of the guillotine may have actually been the ultimate psychological torture, the few seconds of being a sentient, disembodied observer of your own death.
In the early 19th century, if you were wealthy and your teeth had rotted away due to a diet of refined sugar and zero hygiene, you didn't get porcelain veneers, you got Waterloo teeth. Dentures were traditionally made from ivory or bone, but they looked unnatural and rotted quickly. The gold standard for a natural smile was quite literally natural teeth. This created a macabre market for resurrection men, grave robbers, who would break into fresh graves specifically to pull the teeth of the deceased. However, the greatest harvest in dental history occurred on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo. As thousands of young, healthy soldiers lay dead on the field, scavengers moved in with pliers, filling bags with thousands of teeth that would eventually find their way into the mouths of the London elite. The process of getting these dentures fitted was a masterclass in agony. There was no Novocaine and no high-speed drills. To prepare a mouth for dentures, a dentist, who was often just a local blacksmith or barber, would have to extract any remaining rotten stumps. This was done using a dental key, a brutal iron tool that functioned like a lug wrench. It was hooked over the tooth and turned, using the jawbone as a fulcrum. It didn't just pull the tooth, it often fractured the jaw or tore away large chunks of the gum. The hygiene of these dead men's teeth was non-existent. While the teeth were cleaned and polished, they often still carried the bacteria or diseases of their former owners. Syphilis, for instance, could be transmitted via the dental transplant. Furthermore, because the teeth were set into ivory bases that absorbed saliva and food particles, the dentures would eventually begin to putrefy. A Victorian gentleman's perfect smile often carried the literal stench of the grave, a rotting collection of battlefield trophies held together by wire and pride. When Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays in 1895, the world viewed it as a miracle of the new age. It was the first time humans could see through solid matter without a scalpel. But because the light was invisible and didn't burn the skin immediately, people assumed it was completely harmless. X-rays became the ultimate Victorian party trick. Wealthy socialites would hire radiographers to come to their homes and take bone portraits of guests who would sit for up to an hour under a humming, glowing vacuum tube. The X-ray mania extended to the high street. Shoe stores installed pediscopes, X-ray machines that allowed customers, mostly children, to see the bones of their feet inside new shoes to check the fit. Kids would stand on these machines and stare at their own glowing skeletons for minutes at a time, receiving massive doses of radiation directly into their developing bones. The horror revealed itself for months or years. Early researchers, unaware of the cumulative nature of radiation, used their own hands to tune the machines. They would hold their hand between the tube and the screen to see if the image was sharp. Slowly, their skin would redden, then blister and peel in a sunburn that never healed. This was radiodermatitis. Eventually, the flesh would become cancerous. Many early pioneers of the X-ray, now known as the radiation martyrs, had to have their fingers, then their hands, and finally their arms amputated as the rot moved up their bodies. Clarence Daly, an assistant to Thomas Edison, was one of the most famous victims. After years of testing X-ray tubes, his hair fell out, his skin became a mass of ulcers, and he eventually lost both arms before dying in agony at the age of 39. Edison was so horrified by what the invisible light had done to his friend that he abandoned all X-ray research, famously stating, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I am afraid of them." In the quest to see the invisible, the first generation of radiologists unknowingly turned themselves into living, decaying monuments to the dangers of the unknown. In the mid-1800s, the Lucifer match was a marvel of convenience, but for the women and children who made them, it was a biological nightmare. The matches were tipped with white phosphorus, a highly toxic and volatile chemical. The match girls worked 14-hour days in poorly ventilated factories, breathing in phosphorus fumes and eating their meager meals at their workstations with hands covered in chemical dust. The first sign of the phossy jaw was a simple toothache, but as the phosphorus was absorbed through the gums and into the bone, it caused a horrific chemical reaction called osteonecrosis.
The jawbone would literally begin to rot and die while still inside the person's face. The bone would take on a greenish-white ghostly glow in the dark, a literal luminescence that could be seen when the girls walked home at night. As the necrosis progressed, the gums would recede, and the jaw would begin to leak foul-smelling pus. The stench of the rotting bone was so potent that the girls were often shunned by their families and forced to live in isolation. In many cases, the only cure was a radical surgery, the total removal of the lower jawbone. Without it, the infection would eventually spread to the brain, causing a slow and agonizing death. The factory owners knew about the risks, but refused to switch to the safer, more expensive red phosphorus. It wasn't until the famous Match Girls strike of 1888 in London, one of the first times unskilled female workers successfully revolted, that the public truly understood the cost of their instant light. These women weren't just workers, they were human candles, slowly being consumed by the very light they produced.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, the concept of a blood type didn't exist. Doctors viewed blood as a generic vital fluid that carried a person's temperament. If a patient was violent or insane, the medical logic was simple: drain their angry blood and replace it with something more peaceful, like the blood of a gentle lamb. The first human blood transfusions were experiments in cross-species horror. In 1667, Jean-Baptiste Denis, physician to King Louis XIV, famously infused the blood of a sheep into a feverish young boy. Miraculously, the boy survived, likely because the amount was small enough not to trigger a fatal immune response, but others were not so lucky. Patients often suffered from what we now know as hemolytic transfusion reactions. Their bodies would go into shock, their urine would turn black as their kidneys failed, and they would die in excruciating pain. When the church eventually banned animal-to-human transfusions, doctors didn't stop experimenting. They just changed the liquid. In the mid-19th century, particularly during the cholera outbreaks in North America, doctors became convinced that milk was a perfect substitute for blood. They believed the fat particles in milk would transform into white blood cells. They would hook up a funnel and a tube directly to a patient's vein and pour in fresh cow or goat milk. While some patients seemed to rally for a few minutes, most quickly succumbed to massive fat embolisms or systemic infections. The milk would curdle in the bloodstream, essentially turning the patient into a human milkshake from the inside out. Even when they finally returned to human blood transfers, the process was gruesome. Without anticoagulants, the blood would often clot inside the tubes. Surgeons would use direct transfusion, literally sewing the artery of a healthy donor to the vein of the patient. The donor had no way of knowing how much blood they were losing, and it wasn't uncommon for both the patient and the heroic donor to pass out or die simultaneously from the strain. To the Victorian poor, the workhouse was the Bastille of the pauper. It was designed to be so miserable, so degrading, and so physically taxing that only those on the absolute brink of starvation would ever apply for entry. Upon entering, families were forcibly separated, husbands from wives, mothers from children, and stripped of their clothes to be scrubbed with harsh lye soap. The most notorious task assigned to the able-bodied men in these institutions was bone crushing. The workhouse would purchase tons of animal bones from slaughterhouses, often with rotting gristle and meat still attached. The inmates were locked in sheds and forced to pound these bones into dust using heavy iron rammers. This dust was then sold as fertilizer. The air in these sheds was thick with bone stink and shards of marrow. The conditions reached a horrifying peak in the Andover workhouse scandal of 1845. The inmates were so starved, surviving on a diet of watery gruel and maggoty bread, that they began to fight over the rotting bones they were supposed to be crushing. Witnesses reported that men were gnawing on the fetid gristle and sucking the marrow from the putrid animal remains just to stay alive. The scandal eventually led to the banning of bone crushing, but it was replaced by equally soul-crushing tasks like oakum picking, where inmates had to unpick old tarry ropes with their bare fingers until their nails bled.
The workhouse wasn't a charity, it was a deterrent. The authorities believed that poverty was a moral failing, and the cure was a system of labor so grueling that death often seemed like the more merciful option. Even in death, the workhouse didn't let go. The bodies of unclaimed inmates were often sold to medical schools for dissection, ensuring that even their bones served the state one last time. You've seen the movies. The brave knight in shining armor, the beautiful princess in a silk gown, the majestic marble cities of Rome and Greece. We've been sold a version of history that smells like lavender and looks like a filtered Instagram post. But if you actually stepped out of a time machine into the golden ages of the past, the first thing that would hit you isn't the majesty, it's the stench. History wasn't a costume drama. It was a non-stop battle against infection, parasites, and a level of grime that would make a modern landfill look like a surgery room. Forget what you saw on the big screen. The truth is much, much darker. Hollywood loves a good ballroom scene. They show us the Victorian era or the Renaissance with polished floors and sparkling chandeliers. What they don't show you is that beneath those silk skirts, nobody had bathed in months. In fact, for large chunks of Western history, people believed that water was the enemy. During the height of the Black Death and for centuries after, the leading medical experts argued that opening your pores with warm water would allow deadly miasmas to enter your body and kill you. So the wealthiest elites in the world simply stopped washing. Imagine the most crowded subway car you've ever been in on a hot summer day. Now multiply that smell by 1,000, add the scent of rotting teeth, and dress it in velvet. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King who built the magnificent Palace of Versailles, is rumored to have taken only 3 baths in his entire life. When his mistresses complained about his odor, he simply doused himself in more heavy musk-based perfume. This wasn't luxury, it was a desperate attempt to mask the scent of decaying skin and unwashed sweat. And it wasn't just the people, the cities themselves were open-air sewers. In ancient Rome, often portrayed as a pinnacle of hygiene, the public toilets were a nightmare scenario. There was no toilet paper. Instead, everyone shared a single sponge on a stick, soaking in a bucket of salt water. These communal latrines were so poorly ventilated that methane gas would often build up in the pipes, causing literal explosions of fire and filth beneath the person sitting there. To make matters worse, Roman dry cleaners collected human urine in large vats to use as bleach for their togas. If you were walking down a Roman street, you weren't smelling incense, you were smelling ammonia and stagnant waste. Moving into the medieval period, things got even grimmer. London and Paris were built without any thought for drainage. People lived by the rule of gare de l'eau, an adaptation of the French gare de l'eau, watch out for the water. This was the warning shout you'd hear before a neighbor emptied their chamber pot out of a second-story window directly onto the street. The mud you see in movies like Braveheart or Kingdom of Heaven, that wasn't just dirt and rainwater. It was a thick, fermented soup of human and animal excrement that lined every thoroughfare. This lack of sanitation turned the most basic injury into a death sentence. In a world before germ theory, a simple paper cut or a blister from a new shoe could lead to gangrene or sepsis within days. Doctors, if you could even call them that, would move from dissecting a diseased corpse straight to delivering a baby without so much as wiping their hands on a rag. They believed diseases were caused by bad air or an imbalance of humors. To fix you, they might apply a paste made of pigeon droppings to your open wound or attach leeches to your neck to suck out the excess blood. Millions of people throughout history, including George Washington, likely died not from their original illness, but because their doctors bled them into a state of total cardiovascular collapse. And the medicines themselves, they were a chemist's nightmare. Ancient and medieval pharmacies were stocked with ingredients that would be classified as hazardous waste today. To treat a cough, you might be given a syrup containing heroin or arsenic. To cure a skin condition, doctors might prescribe mercury, a toxic heavy metal that causes your teeth to fall out, your skin to peel, and your mind to descend into madness. In the Victorian era, mercury rubs were a standard treatment for syphilis. The saying went, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." The treatment was often more agonizing and disfiguring than the disease itself. And then there was the trepanning. If you suffered from persistent headaches or demonic possession, which we now know as epilepsy or mental illness, ancient doctors had a very direct solution. They would take a hand drill or a flint stone and bore a literal hole into your skull while you were fully conscious. The goal was to let the evil spirits or pressure escape. Archaeologists have found thousands of prehistoric skulls with these holes. While some people actually survived the procedure, most were left with permanent brain damage or succumbed to the inevitable brain infection that followed. Movies show us the wise healer using secret herbs to save the day. The reality was a world of screaming patients, blood-stained floors, and cures that were essentially slow-acting poisons. In the past, the doctor wasn't the person you saved. They were the last person you ever saw.
When you watch a movie set in the medieval era, you often see a grand feast. There are giant roasted pigs, overflowing baskets of fruit, and golden chalices of wine. It looks like a rustic, organic paradise. But the reality of historical dining was a desperate gamble between malnutrition and acute poisoning. For most of human history, dinner was a gamble that could end in a slow, agonizing death. For the lower classes, which made up 95% of the population, the diet was mind-numbingly bleak. Most people lived on a pottage, a thick, brownish stew that stayed on the fire for weeks at a time. They would simply add whatever they found each day, a handful of wilted cabbage, some oats, or, if they were lucky, a scrap of rancid fat. Because there was no refrigeration, the pot was never truly cleaned. It was a breeding ground for bacteria, and it tasted like scorched earth. But the blandness was the least of their worries. The real killer was hiding in the grain. In damp years, rye, the staple grain for the poor, would often be infected with a fungus called ergot. When people ate bread made from this tainted rye, they suffered from St. Anthony's fire. This wasn't just a stomachache, it was a horrifying hallucinogenic nightmare. Ergot contains lysergic acid, a precursor to LSD. Entire villages would descend into mass hysteria, suffering from vivid hallucinations, burning sensations in their limbs, and eventually gangrene that caused their blackened fingers and toes to literally drop off. People thought they were being possessed by demons. In reality, they were just eating the only bread they could afford. If you were wealthy, your table was more varied, but arguably more toxic. Hollywood shows the elite drinking from silver goblets, but for centuries, the secret ingredient in the finest kitchens was lead. The Romans, for example, loved a sweetener called sapa. They made it by boiling unfermented grape juice down in lead pots. The lead leached into the syrup, creating lead acetate, literally lead sugar. They put this stuff in everything. It made the wine taste better, but it also caused chronic lead poisoning, leading to infertility, madness, and organ failure. Some historians argue that the Roman elite essentially poisoned themselves into extinction. By the time we reached the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, the food industry had become a literal crime scene. As people moved into crowded cities, they became dependent on store-bought food, and the lack of regulation was catastrophic. To save money, bakers would stretch their flour by mixing in crushed chalk, plaster of Paris, or even powdered bones. To make old, sour milk look fresh and creamy, sellers would add formaldehyde and a splash of sheep's brains for texture. The vibrant colors of Victorian candy, the kind of sweets you see in nostalgic holiday movies, were the most dangerous of all. That bright, appetizing green was often achieved using Shields green, a pigment loaded with arsenic. The brilliant reds came from red lead or mercury. Children were essentially sucking on flavored poison. Even the tea wasn't safe. Used tea leaves were often recycled by drying them and coloring them with black lead or copper carbonate to make them look new again.
Water, the most basic necessity, was the deadliest of all. In cities like London, the same river that provided drinking water was also the primary dump for slaughterhouse waste and human sewage. This led to massive outbreaks of cholera, a disease that causes such violent dehydration that a healthy person could turn into a shriveled, blue-skinned corpse in less than 12 hours. People drank beer and wine not because they wanted to be drunk all day, but because the fermentation process was the only thing that made the liquid somewhat safe to swallow. In the movies, the past looks like a world of natural food. In reality, every meal was a battlefield. Whether it was the fungus in your bread, the lead in your wine, or the arsenic in your candy, the history of eating was a slow-motion massacre. Modern office work might be soul-crushing, and manual labor today is certainly exhausting, but nothing in the 21st century compares to the sheer, nightmare-inducing horror of historical employment. In the movies, we see the blacksmith as a muscular, heroic figure, or the scullery maid as a plucky girl with a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The truth is that for most of history, your job wasn't just what you did, it was how you died. Let's start with one of the stomach-churning jobs in Victorian London, the pure finder. Despite the elegant name, the job was anything but pure. These individuals wandered the streets collecting dog feces. Why? Because the leather tanning industry needed it. The chemicals in the pure, the waste, were used to soften high-end leather for the gloves and bookbindings of the elite. These workers, often the elderly or the desperate, handled this waste with their bare hands all day, every day, for a few pennies. They lived in a constant state of bacterial infection, their skin permanently stained, and their lungs filled with the scent of rot. If you thought that was bad, consider the fuller of ancient Rome. If you wore a beautiful white toga, you owed it to a man who spent his entire day standing waist-deep in a vat of human urine. As we mentioned before, urine was the primary bleaching agent of the ancient world. Fullers would jump into these vats and tread on the clothes like they were crushing grapes, using the ammonia to strip the grease from the wool. The fumes were so caustic they would burn the workers' eyes and lungs, and their skin would eventually begin to peel off from the constant chemical exposure. As the world moved into the Industrial Revolution, the workplace became a literal slaughterhouse. Take the matchstick makers, mostly young women and teenage girls. They spent 14 hours a day dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus. Over time, the toxic fumes would seep into their jawbones, causing a condition known as phossy jaw. Their teeth would rot, their gums would glow a ghostly green in the dark, and eventually their jawbones would literally abscess and crumble away. The pain was so intense that some women had to have their entire lower jaws surgically removed just to stop the rot from reaching their brains. And then there were the children. While Hollywood often portrays child labor as a tough but character-building Dickensian trope, the reality was horrific. Chimney sweeps were often as young as 4 or 5 years old, because only they were small enough to fit inside the narrow, soot-choked flues of London's mansions. These children were forced up chimneys by masters who would sometimes light small fires beneath their feet to encourage them to climb faster. They suffered from sweeps cancer, caused by the constant contact of soot against their skin, and many became stuck in the narrow bends of the chimneys, dying of suffocation behind the walls of a luxury home, while a dinner party happened in the next room. In the Victorian factories, children also worked as piecers. Their job was to lean over massive, high-speed spinning machines to tie broken threads together while the machines were still running. If they weren't fast enough, the heavy iron machinery would scalp them or crush their hands. They worked in temperatures exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit with zero ventilation, breathing in cotton dust that turned their lungs into useless bags of scar tissue by the time they reached their 20s, if they lived that long. Even the prestigious jobs were lethal.
Being a hatter in the 18th and 19th centuries meant working with mercury to turn fur into felt. The mercury entered the bloodstream and attacked the nervous system, leading to the Mad Hatter syndrome, uncontrollable tremors, slurred speech, and vivid hallucinations. These men didn't go mad because they were eccentric. They were literally losing their minds as their brains were dissolved by heavy metals. When you see the beautiful artifacts of history in a museum, the silk gloves, the tall hats, the intricate stone carvings, remember that they weren't just made with skill. They were made with the blood, the limbs, and the sanity of people who had no choice but to work in the most hellish conditions imaginable.
We often romanticize the idea of hearth and home in history. Movies give us the cozy English cottage with a roaring fire, or the sprawling Roman villa with its airy courtyards. We imagine a simpler time, away from the smog and noise of modern life. But the truth is that for the vast majority of human history, your home wasn't a sanctuary, it was a death trap. If the diseases on the street didn't get you, the very walls of your house likely would. In the medieval and early modern periods, ventilation was a luxury no one could afford. To keep the heat in, houses were built tight and cramped, often sharing walls with livestock. If you were a peasant, you slept on a pallet of straw that was rarely changed. This straw became a thriving ecosystem for fleas, lice, and bedbugs. These weren't just an itchy nuisance, they were the primary transport system for the bubonic plague and typhus. You weren't just sleeping in your bed, you were sleeping in a biological weapon. The air inside these homes was a thick, gray soup. Without chimneys, which didn't become common for the lower classes until much later, smoke from the central cooking fire simply swirled around the room before slowly leaking out of a hole in the thatch roof. This led to a lifetime of chronic respiratory infections. Archaeologists examining ancient skeletons often find that even teenagers had the lung carbonization of a lifelong heavy smoker. Everyone lived in a state of perpetual hacking and coughing, their eyes red and watering from the stinging wood smoke. As we moved into the 19th century, modern comforts only made things more lethal. This was the era of the Victorian House of Horrors. One of the most famous examples was the obsession with the color green. A brilliant hue known as Paris green became the height of fashion for wallpaper. The secret ingredient? Arsenic. When the damp air of a typical London or New York home hit that wallpaper, it caused a chemical reaction that released toxic arsenic gas into the bedroom. People would go to sleep in a beautifully decorated room and never wake up, their bodies slowly shut down by the very walls they admired. Even the light was dangerous. Before electricity, the introduction of gas lighting was seen as a miracle of progress. But the early gas pipes were notoriously leaky, filling homes with carbon monoxide and explosive fumes. It wasn't uncommon for an entire tenement building to be leveled because someone struck a match in a hallway filled with gas. And if you didn't have gas, you used candles made of tallow, rendered animal fat. These candles smelled like a slaughterhouse and dripped hot, rancid grease everywhere, creating a massive fire hazard in homes built almost entirely of dry wood and straw. Water systems were equally catastrophic. In the mid-1800s, the S-bend pipe was a revolutionary invention for toilets, but before its widespread use, sewer gases, including methane and hydrogen sulfide, would often back up directly into people's homes through their drains. There are recorded instances of exploding toilets where a person walked into their bathroom with a candle and was met with a literal blast of sewage and fire. Then there were the tenements of the Industrial Revolution. In cities like New York, as many as 12 people would live in a single windowless room. There was no running water and no privacy. The privy was a hole in the ground in a shared courtyard that served hundreds of people. The overflow would often seep into the basement apartments where the poorest families lived. Imagine sleeping on a floor that was constantly damp with the waste of your neighbors.
This was the greatest century, according to many history books, but for the people living in it, it was a suffocating, poisonous nightmare. The past wasn't a place of clean, simple living. It was a world where your wallpaper could poison you, your bed could give you the plague, and your toilet could explode. Home wasn't where the heart was, it was where the danger was closest. In historical movies, the costumes are breathtaking. We see Marie Antoinette in towering powdered wigs and Victorian ladies in impossibly tiny corsets, their skin as white as porcelain. We admire the elegance, the silhouette, and the sheer artistry of it all. But beneath the silk and lace lay a gruesome reality. For centuries, fashion was a slow-motion suicide pact. To be beautiful was to flirt with deformity, disease, and death. That porcelain skin look that dominated European beauty standards for centuries wasn't achieved with soap and water. It was achieved with Venetian ceruse. This was a thick white foundation made by mixing vinegar with high concentrations of lead. Women and men would slather this onto their faces, necks, and chests to hide smallpox scars and sun damage. Over time, the lead was absorbed through the skin, causing their hair to fall out, their teeth to rot, and their skin to turn a permanent, sickly, grayish purple. To fix the gray skin, they simply applied more lead. It was a cycle of toxic decay that eventually led to organ failure and insanity. And the eyes? The doe-eyed look that we see in portraits of the Renaissance was often the result of belladonna. Women would drop extracts of the deadly nightshade plant directly into their eyes to dilate their pupils, giving them a watery, seductive stare. The side effects included blurred vision, a permanent inability to focus, and eventually total blindness. They were literally sacrificing their sight for a few years of looking dreamy. Then there was the silhouette. The Victorian obsession with the wasp waist took the corset from a supportive garment to an instrument of torture. A tight-laced corset didn't just squeeze the fat, it physically rearranged the internal organs. Lungs were pushed upward, causing fainting spells, which movies portray as dainty, but were actually the result of oxygen deprivation. The liver was crushed, the stomach compressed so much that digestion became a painful ordeal, and in extreme cases, the lower ribs were pushed inward until they actually fractured or pierced internal organs. Even the hair wasn't safe. The massive, elaborate wigs of the 18th century were rarely taken off. To keep the hair in place, it was pasted with animal lard and then powdered with flour. This made the wigs a literal mobile home for lice and, worse, rodents. There are documented accounts of women having to sleep with wire cages over their heads to prevent rats from burrowing into their lard-filled wigs during the night. The itching was so intense that scratching sticks, long, thin rods made of ivory or silver, were a standard accessory so a lady could reach inside her wig to dig at her scalp without ruining the high style. Perhaps the most terrifying fashion trend was the crinoline, the giant hoop skirts of the mid-19th century. While they looked majestic in a ballroom, they were a death trap. Made from highly flammable fabrics and extending several feet from the body, women often didn't have any idea how close they were to a fireplace or a fallen candle. Thousands of women burned to death because their skirts caught fire, and the sheer volume of fabric meant they couldn't extinguish the flames or move fast enough to escape. In 1863, a fire at a church in Santiago killed over 2,000 people. Many were women who became trapped in the doorways because their massive crinoline skirts blocked the exits, creating a fatal human bottleneck. The men weren't exempt either. The high collar of the late 19th century was so stiff and tight, it was nicknamed the father killer. It was buttoned so securely that it could cut off the blood supply to the carotid artery. Men who fell asleep in their chairs after a few drinks were found dead the next morning, essentially strangled by their own fashionable shirts. When you look at a vintage portrait, don't just see the elegance, see the lead-poisoned skin, the crushed ribs, the blinded eyes, and the constant fear of bursting into flames. Beauty didn't just hurt, it killed. In our modern world, we view the legal system as a search for truth, governed by innocent until proven guilty. But for most of human history, the law wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle, terror, and the absolute breaking of the human spirit. If you were accused of a crime in the Middle Ages or the early modern period, the goal wasn't to find out if you did it. It was to make you confess by any means necessary. Movies often show a quick hanging or a dramatic courtroom speech. The reality was much slower and infinitely more sadistic. Take the trial by ordeal. This was a common legal practice where God was expected to intervene to prove someone's innocence. In trial by iron, an accused person had to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 paces. Their hands were then bandaged. 3 days later, a priest would inspect the wound. If the wound was healing cleanly, you were innocent. If it was infected, which, given the lack of sanitation we've discussed, was almost a certainty, you were guilty and promptly executed. You were essentially being asked to perform a biological miracle to avoid the gallows. If the ordeal didn't get you, the questioning would. Torture wasn't just a dark secret, it was a formalized legal part of the judicial process. The devices used were masterpieces of horrifying engineering. There was the rack, which slowly pulled a person's joints out of their sockets until the tendons snapped like rubber bands. There was the scavenger's daughter, an iron hoop that did the opposite. It compressed the body into a ball, forcing blood out of the nose and ears. The goal of these sessions wasn't just pain, it was to extract a name. This is how the great witch crazes of Europe and America spiraled out of control. Once a person was broken by the Iron Maiden or the thumbscrews, they would say anything to make the pain stop. They would name their neighbors, their friends, and even their own children as fellow witches. This created a domino effect of blood that wiped out entire villages, all under the legal supervision of the state. Even when the verdict was reached, the justice was far from over. Execution in the past was rarely a quick affair. It was designed to be a public entertainment event, a theater of cruelty to remind the masses of the power of the crown. In London, execution days at Tyburn were public holidays. Thousands would gather, bringing picnics and souvenirs to watch a person be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This process was a literal descent into hell. The victim was hanged until they were almost dead, then cut down while still conscious. Then came the drawing. Their internal organs were removed and burned before their eyes. Finally, their body was chopped into 4 pieces to be displayed at different gates of the city as a warning. This wasn't a rare punishment, it was the standard sentence for treason for hundreds of years. In France, before the mercy of the guillotine, there was the breaking wheel. A criminal would be tied to a massive wagon wheel, and the executioner would use an iron bar to systematically shatter every major bone in their limbs. The mangled person was then woven into the spokes of the wheel and hoisted onto a pole to die of thirst and shock over several days while crows pecked at them. The most disturbing part? The crowds loved it. Without television or the internet, these public displays of agony were the primary form of entertainment. People would jostle for a better view, and street vendors would sell snacks and souvenirs. We like to think of our ancestors as noble or simple people, but for centuries, the highlight of a community's social calendar was watching a fellow human being be systematically dismantled in the name of the law. The past wasn't a place of fair fights and honor. It was a world where the law was a monster, and justice was just another word for state-sponsored butchery. In our modern world, we view childhood as a protected, golden era of innocence. We have pediatricians, mandatory schooling, and child safety locks on everything. But if you look at the history of childhood through the lens of a Hollywood movie, you see rosy-cheeked orphans or adventurous kids playing in haystacks. The reality was a cold, hard statistics game where half of all children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. For most of history, being born was the most dangerous thing you could ever do.
From the moment a child was born, they were entering a world that didn't know how to keep them alive. In the 18th and 19th centuries, if a mother couldn't breastfeed, the formula given to infants was often a mixture of flour, water, and sugar known as pap. This mixture was frequently stored in unwashable bottles. These Victorian nursing bottles, nicknamed murder bottles, had long, thin rubber tubes that were impossible to clean. Inside those tubes, colonies of deadly bacteria thrived. A mother would lovingly feed her child, unknowingly delivering a dose of lethal E. coli or salmonella. Thousands of infants died of summer diarrhea, a polite term for a gruesome death by dehydration caused by these contaminated bottles. If a child survived infancy, they weren't greeted with toys and games. They were greeted with the harsh reality of miniature adulthood. In the eyes of history, a 7-year-old wasn't a child. They were a worker who happened to be small. We've already discussed the horrors of chimney sweeps and factory piecers, but even in rural life, children were expected to handle heavy machinery and livestock from dawn till dusk. There were no safety regulations. If a child lost a finger to a plow or a foot to a horse, they were simply clumsy, and the infection that followed was seen as God's will. Education, for the few who received it, was often a system of systematic trauma. In many 18th century schools, the birch or the cane was used for the slightest infraction. If a child struggled to memorize a Latin verse or dared to use their left hand to write, they were publicly beaten. In some schools, children were forced to wear a dunce cap and stand in a corner for hours, or worse, they were made to wear heavy wooden yokes to correct their posture. The goal wasn't to nurture a mind, it was to break a spirit. Then there was the sheer environmental terror. Because children have smaller bodies and faster metabolisms, they were the first to succumb to the bad air and toxic food we discussed in previous chapters. A child living in a coal mining town breathed in more soot than an adult's lungs could handle, leading to rickets, a condition where bones become so soft they bow and deform due to lack of vitamin D, sunlight, and poor nutrition. Imagine a generation of children with twisted legs and stunted growth forced to hobble into dark mines to work 14-hour shifts. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the emotional detachment parents were often forced to maintain. Because child mortality was so incredibly high, many parents didn't even name their children until they reached the age of 2 or 3. It was a defense mechanism against the almost certain grief that was coming. In many historical records, you will see a family give 3 or 4 consecutive children the same name, as each one was died and replaced by the next. Even the toys were lethal. Before safety standards, rocking horses were often painted with lead-based paint that children would chew on. Dolls were stuffed with flammable hair and dressed in fabrics treated with arsenic. There was no safe space for a child. Whether it was the milk they drank, the air they breathed, or the work they were forced to do, history treated children as disposable assets. When you see a movie with a group of laughing, healthy children in the background of a medieval village, remember, statistically, half of them shouldn't be there, and the other half are likely in constant pain, hungry, and one cold winter away from a nameless grave.
In Hollywood, ancient warfare is a choreographed dance. We see heroes like Maximus or Achilles spinning through the battlefield, delivering clean, lethal strikes while looking magnificent in their polished armor. The music swells, the sun sets over the horizon, and even the deaths look noble. But the reality of pre-modern combat was a chaotic, wet, and agonizing meat grinder. It wasn't about skill as much as it was about the stomach-churning endurance of hacking through bone and sinew in a crowd of screaming men. When 2 ancient or medieval armies met, the clash of shields wasn't just a loud noise, it was a physical wall of pressure. Soldiers in the front lines were often crushed to death without ever being touched by an enemy's blade. The weight of thousands of men pushing from behind could literally squeeze the breath out of you or trip you into the mud, where you would be trampled into the muck by your own side.
If you managed to stay upright, your world shrank to a 3-foot space filled with the smell of iron, sweat, and bowels. The weapons themselves were not the surgical tools movies suggest. A sword stroke rarely took a head off in one clean motion. Instead, it would hack into a shoulder, getting stuck in the bone. Soldiers would have to kick the dying man away just to wrench their weapon free. Most combatants used blunt force, maces, warhammers, and axes designed to crush helmets and shatter skulls. This meant the battlefield was filled with the sound of cracking rather than clanking. Men didn't die instantly. They lay on the ground with shattered pelvises or smashed faces, waiting for hours or days for the end to come. Then there was the nightmare of the wounded. If you survived the battle but took an arrow to the gut or a gash to the leg, your nightmare was only beginning. As we've learned, there were no antibiotics. An arrow wound was particularly terrifying because the wooden shaft would often splinter or the arrowhead would be coated in soil and filth. To remove it, surgeons would often push the arrow all the way through the limb to snap the head off or use a tool called a duck's bill to pry open the wound. Without anesthesia, the shock alone killed thousands. The aftermath of a battle was a landscape of pure horror. In the movies, the camera pans over a few strategically placed bodies. In reality, thousands of corpses and thousands of dying horses were left to rot where they fell. The victors rarely had the resources to bury everyone. This created a massive biological hazard. The local water supply would become toxic with the fluids of the decaying, leading to outbreaks of dysentery that killed more soldiers than the actual fighting did. In many wars, such as the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War, for every soldier killed by a bullet, 2 or 3 died from camp fever or diarrhea. Siege warfare was even worse. When a city was surrounded, the inhabitants didn't just run out of food, they descended into a primal state of survival. To save resources, the useless mouths, the elderly, the sick, and the children, were often kicked out of the city gates into the no-man's zone between the city walls and the enemy camp. Trapped with no food and no shelter, they would starve to death in full view of both sides. Inside the walls, people resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, and eventually wallpaper paste or shoe leather. History tells us about the glory of Rome or the gallantry of the knights, but those are myths created by the survivors. For the man on the ground, war was a filthy, loud, and incredibly slow way to die. It wasn't a test of character, it was a test of how much trauma a human body could take before it finally gave up. In modern movies, characters are often portrayed as skeptics or rational thinkers who just happen to live in the past. We see them questioning authority or rolling their eyes at old wives' tales. But the reality is that for people in the ancient and medieval world, there was no such thing as science or random luck. Every shadow, every sneeze, and every thunderstorm was a direct message from the supernatural. They lived in a world where the air was thick with demons, and your neighbor's evil eye could literally kill your children. Fear was the primary emotion of daily life. Without an understanding of weather patterns or meteorology, a drought wasn't a climate event. It was a sign that someone in the village had committed a secret sin. This created a culture of extreme paranoia and surveillance. Everyone watched everyone else. If your cow stopped producing milk, you didn't look for a parasite. You looked for the woman down the street who seemed a little too quiet or who owned a black cat. This everyday fear is what fueled the horrific witch trials we discussed earlier. It wasn't just a few crazy leaders, it was a terrified population looking for a scapegoat for their own suffering. Then there was the terrifying concept of the living dead. Long before Hollywood gave us zombies and vampires, people in Eastern Europe and even New England lived in genuine terror of the undead. If a family was dying of tuberculosis, a disease they didn't understand, they believed a deceased relative was reaching back from the grave to drain the life from the survivors. To stop this, they would exhume the bodies of their loved ones. If the corpse appeared bloated or had blood at the mouth, which we now know are natural stages of decomposition, they would perform gruesome rituals. They would flip the body face down, drive stakes through the heart, or in some cases cut out the heart, burn it, and feed the ashes to the sick family members as a cure. Religion, while a source of comfort for many, was also a source of constant pathological pressure. The concept of purgatory and the literal fires of hell were not metaphors to the medieval mind. They were physical places they expected to go if they missed a single confession. This led to the practice of self-flagellation, where groups of people would wander from town to town, whipping their own backs with iron-tipped cords until they bled, hoping to appease a god they believed was responsible for the Black Death. The past wasn't just physically painful, it was a psychological landscape of constant looming damnation. Even the most basic biological functions were shrouded in terrifying superstition. Menstruation was seen as a curse that could wither crops or sour wine just by a woman's presence. Sleep was another danger zone. People believed in the old hag or the Mara, where the word nightmare comes from, a demonic entity that would sit on your chest in the night to suffocate you. What we now call sleep paralysis was for them a literal physical assault by a demon. They lived in a world where you weren't even safe inside your own dreams. Finally, there was the cult of death. Because death was so common, it became a central part of the culture. During the Victorian era, memento mori, or remember you must die, was the ultimate trend. People would take post-mortem photographs where they would prop up the recently deceased, sometimes children, with hidden stands, paint eyes on their closed eyelids, and pose with them for a final family portrait. They lived with the dead, ate with the dead, and slept in rooms where their relatives had just breathed their last. We look back and see simpler times, but the truth is, the people of the past lived in a state of constant low-grade terror. They were trapped in a world where the rules were invisible, the gods were angry, and the only certainty was that life would be short, brutal, and incredibly slow way to die.
If you watch a movie about the French monarchy, you see the Palace of Versailles as a glittering dream of gold, mirrors, and silk. It is presented as the height of human sophistication. But if you actually walked through those halls during the reign of Louis XIV, you would be fighting the urge to vomit. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a sprawling, gilded warehouse for human waste. The palace was designed for beauty, not for plumbing. Despite housing thousands of aristocrats, servants, and hangers-on, there were almost no functional toilets. The noblemen and women, dressed in clothes that cost more than a village's annual harvest, didn't have many options when nature called. Instead of seeking out a rare and filthy communal latrine, they would simply find a quiet corner, a staircase, or a space behind a heavy velvet curtain. The halls literally reeked of human excrement. The Sun King himself lived in a cloud of heavy incense and floral waters to mask the fact that the walls of his home were soaked in urine. Because the floors were rarely deep cleaned, the filth tracked in from the muddy gardens would mix with the indoor waste, creating a permanent sticky grime on the parquet floors. It was so bad that contemporary accounts mention visitors being overwhelmed by the smell before they even reached the palace gates. The servants' lives were even more wretched. They lived in the entresalles, tiny windowless mezzanine floors between the grand rooms. These spaces were infested with rats and lice. Because the palace was built on a marsh, the water was stagnant and mosquito-ridden. Malaria and palace fever were common, even among the elites. The king's own doctors were terrified of the water, so they advised everyone to drink wine or champagne instead. Imagine a palace full of drunken, unwashed aristocrats living in a building that doubled as an open sewer. Personal hygiene was a concept from another planet. The high society baths you see in movies were almost non-existent. People believed that rubbing their skin with a dry linen cloth was enough to be clean. They would change their shirts several times a day, thinking that the white linen absorbed the toxins from their skin, but they wouldn't touch a drop of water.
Underneath those powdered wigs, their scalps were often a mass of sores and parasites. The diet at Versailles was another hidden horror. To show off wealth, meat was served in massive quantities, often slightly turned or rotting. To hide the taste of decay, it was smothered in heavy, spicy sauces. Gout, a painful inflammation of the joints caused by too much rich food and alcohol, was so common that it was seen as a mark of nobility. The king himself suffered so badly from dental decay due to a diet of sugar and no hygiene that when his teeth were pulled, a piece of his jawbone came with them, leaving a hole between his mouth and sinuses. Every time he drank, wine would come out of his nose. This was the grandeur of France. It wasn't a world of romantic whispers and clean silk. It was a world of rotting teeth, dripping ceilings, and a stench so powerful it could knock a modern person unconscious. In movies, the London fog is a romantic, atmospheric backdrop for Sherlock Holmes or Jack the Ripper. It's portrayed as a clean white mist that adds mystery to the cobblestone streets. But in the 19th century, Londoners didn't call it a fog. They called it a pea souper, and it wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. It was a thick, yellow-black chemical soup that could literally choke the life out of you. As the Industrial Revolution hit its stride, millions of coal fires burned simultaneously across the city, in factories, steam engines, and every single home's fireplace. The resulting smoke mixed with the natural moisture of the Thames River to create a smog so dense that it was opaque. This wasn't just dirty air, it was loaded with sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and soot particles. When you inhaled it, the sulfur mixed with the moisture in your lungs to create a mild form of sulfuric acid. You weren't just breathing, you were slowly dissolving your respiratory system from the inside out. The darkness during a pea souper was absolute. It could be high noon and you wouldn't be able to see your own feet. People would get lost on their own doorsteps. There are accounts of people accidentally walking straight into the Thames and drowning because they couldn't distinguish the river from the sidewalk. To navigate, you had to hire link boys, impoverished children who carried torches to lead people through the gloom. But these boys were often in league with gangs. They would lead a wealthy gentleman into a dead-end alley, blow out the torch, and leave him to be robbed or killed in the pitch-black silence. But the air was only half the problem. Below the fog lay the Great Stink. Until the mid-1800s, London had no sewage system. Every drop of waste from millions of people went into cesspools buried beneath their floorboards. When these overflowed, the waste ran into the streets and eventually into the Thames. In the blistering summer of 1858, the river became so thick with human excrement that the smell actually shut down the British Parliament. They had to soak the curtains in chloride of lime just to keep the politicians from fainting. The water people drank was pulled directly from this same river. This led to the terrifying era of cholera. At the time, doctors still believed disease was caused by miasma, or bad smells. When a cholera outbreak hit, they would tell people to burn vinegar or stay indoors. In reality, the water was teeming with bacteria. A person could be perfectly healthy at breakfast and be a blue-skinned, shriveled corpse by dinner, having literally leaked their entire body's fluid through violent, unstoppable diarrhea. Living in a London tenement meant existing in a state of permanent dampness and filth. Walls were often black with life, a polite way of saying they were covered in a moving carpet of bedbugs and cockroaches. To save money on rent, the poorest would pay for a 2-penny hangover. This wasn't a drink, it was a place in a flophouse where you slept standing up, leaning your arms over a long rope stretched across the room. In the morning, the landlord would simply cut the rope to wake everyone up. Victorian London was the capital of the world, but for those living in its shadows, it was a soot-stained purgatory. The fog wasn't a mystery, it was the visible breath of a city that was choking on its own progress.
When we think of ancient Rome, we think of white marble, stoic philosophers, and a civilization so advanced it looks like the precursor to the modern world. Movies like Gladiator show us a clean, organized city of towering monuments. But if you were one of the 1 million people living in Rome at its peak, your life didn't happen in a marble palace. It happened in the Suburra, a sprawling, overcrowded slum that was arguably the most dangerous neighborhood in human history. The apartments of Rome, known as insulae, were the death traps of antiquity. Built by greedy landlords using cheap timber and crumbling sun-dried bricks, these 6- or 7-story buildings were prone to collapsing without warning. There were no building codes and no safety inspections. Even worse than the collapses were the fires. Because people cooked on open braziers in cramped wooden rooms, fires broke out every single night. Rome had no professional fire department for centuries. Instead, private fire brigades owned by wealthy politicians would show up and refuse to pump water until the owner agreed to sell the burning building to them for a fraction of its value. If you couldn't pay, they simply watched your home and everyone inside it burned to ash. The sanitation in these high-rises was non-existent. While Rome is famous for its aqueducts and public baths, the water didn't pump up to the apartments. If you lived on the 5th floor, you had to haul every drop of water up several flights of stairs. Consequently, people rarely washed, and when it came to waste, they didn't go back down the stairs. Just like in the medieval period, the standard Roman procedure was to dump the contents of the chamber pot out of the window. Roman law actually had specific provisions for damage caused by things thrown or poured from buildings, but that was cold comfort when you were hit by a bucket of waste while walking to work. The streets themselves were so narrow and congested that the Emperor Augustus eventually banned carts and wagons from the city during daylight hours. This meant that all the heavy lifting, the hauling of stone, and the delivery of goods happened at night. If you lived in Rome, you never slept. The darkness was a cacophony of iron wheels on stone, shouting teamsters, and the constant threat of being crushed in the dark. There were no streetlights, and the police force was there to protect the emperor, not you. If you stepped outside after dark, you were a target for waylayers, gangs of youths who beat and robbed citizens just for the sport of it. But the most civilized part of Rome was perhaps the most barbaric, the public games. Hollywood portrays the Colosseum as a place of honorable combat. In reality, it was a factory for mass execution and animal cruelty. On a typical day, the morning started with venationes, the slaughter of thousands of exotic animals, lions, elephants, bears, just to show the crowd that Rome could kill nature itself. The smell of blood and animal musk was so overpowering that officials hung giant awnings soaked in perfume to keep the spectators from fainting. The midday entertainment was the public execution of criminals and Christians through damnatio ad bestias, being torn apart by wild animals for the crowd's amusement. By the time the gladiators, who were mostly slaves forced to fight, entered the arena in the afternoon, the sand was already soaked through with gore, and a new layer of fresh sand had to be shoveled over the bodies. The audience didn't just watch, they gambled, ate, and cheered for the most creative ways to end a human life. Ancient Rome wasn't a world of philosophy and law. It was a world of crumbling slums, the constant fear of fire, and a population that was addicted to the smell of blood. The marble was just a thin veneer over a society that lived in filth and died for entertainment. The movies have painted a romantic, salt-sprayed picture of life on the high seas. We see Johnny Depp swinging from ropes with a bottle of rum, or brave explorers standing on clean decks, staring at the horizon of the new world. We imagine the wind in the sails and the thrill of discovery. But in reality, a 17th or 18th century wooden ship was a floating prison, a wooden box of disease, and a buffet for parasites. To sign on as a sailor wasn't an adventure, it was often a death sentence disguised as a job. The first thing you would notice on a ship like the ones used by Columbus or Blackbeard wasn't the sea breeze, it was the overwhelming smell of the bilge. The bilge was the very bottom of the ship where all the leaked seawater, spilled beer, animal waste, and vomit collected into a stagnant black sludge. Because there was no way to drain it, this liquid fermented for months, releasing a stench of hydrogen sulfide that was so thick it could turn the silver coins in a captain's pocket black within days. This was the air the sailors breathed as they slept in cramped, damp hammocks, packed together like sardines. The food was a psychological torture of its own. Without refrigeration, meat was preserved in heavy brine, turning it into a substance as hard and salty as a piece of mahogany. But the staple of the sailors' diet was hardtack, a biscuit made of flour and water that was baked until it was hard rock. To eat it, you had to soak it in coffee or beer or risk breaking your teeth. But it wasn't just hard, it was alive. Hardtack was almost always infested with weevils and maggots. Experienced sailors learned to eat in the dark so they wouldn't have to see the black-headed worms crawling out of their food as they chewed. If you were truly hungry, you just considered the weevils extra protein. Then there was the sea scurvy, the silent killer of the oceans. Before people understood vitamin C, scurvy killed more sailors than all the shipwrecks, storms, and naval battles combined. It was a slow, gruesome disintegration of the body. First, your gums would swell and turn black, eventually rotting away until your teeth fell out one by one. Old wounds you had 10 years ago would suddenly reopen because your body could no longer produce the collagen needed to keep scar tissue together. Finally, your bones would literally soften and you would die of internal bleeding or heart failure. During Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, he lost 116 out of 170 men, most of them to this agonizing plague of the sea. If you got sick or injured during a storm, you were at the mercy of the ship's surgeon. On a naval vessel, the doctor was often just a man who was slightly better with a saw than the rest of the crew. If a cannonball shattered your leg, there was no saving it. You were pinned to a wooden chest, given a leather strap to bite on, and the surgeon would hack through your muscle and bone in seconds. To stop the bleeding, they would plunge the stump into a bucket of boiling pitch or sear it with a red-hot iron. If the shock didn't kill you, the infection from the dirty saw certainly would. And let's talk about the pirate life Hollywood loves so much. There was no pirate code of honor. Most pirates were former merchant sailors who had mutinied because their captains were starving or beating them. Life on a pirate ship was a desperate, short-lived scramble. Because they were outlaws, they couldn't dock at most ports to get fresh water. They spent weeks drinking fermented grog, watered-down rum, which kept them in a state of constant low-grade dehydration and liver damage. And when they did capture a prize, the treasure wasn't usually gold. It was often just crates of cloth, sugar, or most valuable of all, medicine. A ship in the age of sail was a world of 3 L's, lead, log, and lookout. But for the men on board, it was a world of rot, maggots, and the constant fear that the very water you were sailing on would eventually become your grave.
In Hollywood, a medieval castle is a place of warmth and grandeur. We see huge fireplaces, colorful tapestries, and lords and ladies dining in high-ceilinged halls. It looks sturdy, safe, and romantic. But in reality, a castle was not a home. It was a military bunker made of stone, designed for defense, not comfort. Living in one was like living inside a damped, lightless refrigerator. The first thing you would realize upon entering a castle was the bone-chilling cold. Stone walls, often 6 to 10 feet thick, were incredible at keeping out enemy battering rams, but they were even better at trapping moisture and cold. Even in the height of summer, the interior of a castle remained clammy and dark. In the winter, it was a nightmare. While movies show massive, roaring fires, the heat rarely traveled more than a few feet from the hearth. The rest of the room remained at temperatures near freezing. To survive the night, people didn't just wear pajamas. They slept in furs, heavy wool cloaks, and hats, huddled together for body heat. The beautiful tapestries you see on the walls weren't just for decoration. They were a desperate attempt at insulation. Without them, the stone walls would sweat. Condensation would build up and trickle down the walls, turning the floors into a slippery, muddy mess. The floors themselves were covered in rushes, dried grass, or straw.
While this sounds rustic, the reality was disgusting. As the Dutch philosopher Erasmus noted, these rushes were rarely changed. Beneath the top layer lay a fermented collection of spittle, vomit, the leakage of dogs and humans, scraps of thrown bones, and everything that is abominable. Lighting was another constant struggle. Windows were narrow slits, designed to keep out arrows, not let in light, and were rarely glazed with glass, which was an expensive luxury. Instead, they were covered with translucent animal bladders or oiled linen. This kept the wind out, but kept the rooms in a state of permanent gloomy twilight. To see, people used rushlights, pieces of dried grass dipped in smelly animal fat. These flickered, smoked, and filled the air with a greasy, rancid stench that stuck to your clothes and hair. Then there was the garde-robe, the medieval castle toilet. These were small, freezing stone cubicles built into the thickness of the outer wall. There was no plumbing, there was simply a hole in the stone seat that dropped directly into the castle moat or a cesspit at the base of the wall. Because the smell was so powerful, nobles would often hang their expensive wool and silk clothes in the garde-robe. They believed the ammonia from the waste acted as a natural pesticide to kill the moths and lice that infested their garments. Imagine putting on a cloak that had been marinating in the fumes of a latrine all night. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Even the Great Hall was a communal sleeping space. Servants, soldiers, and guests would all roll out mats on the floor and sleep side by side. The lord and lady might have a solar or a private chamber, but even then they were surrounded by attendants. Life was loud, crowded, and smelled of unwashed bodies, wet dogs, and wood smoke. Living in a castle wasn't a fairy tale. It was a life of chronic joint pain from the dampness, respiratory issues from the smoke, and a constant losing battle against the cold. The stone walls that kept the enemies out also kept the misery in. Hollywood has given us the Wild West of legend, rugged cowboys with perfect teeth, dramatic quick-draw duels at noon, and vast, beautiful landscapes. We see the outlaw as a misunderstood rebel, and the frontier town as a place of excitement. But the reality of the American West in the mid to late 1800s was a grueling, filthy, and profoundly boring struggle for survival. It wasn't a movie set, it was a sun-scorched wasteland where the leading cause of death wasn't a bullet, but a bacterial infection.